Hello and welcome to this week's Fantasy Football Devotions. I am your host, Pastor Aaron Layne. Now I know I haven't done some fantasy football devotions here in a couple of weeks. One, because I've been incredibly busy and had little things like the sermon to get ready and stuff like that. But then also, quite frankly, I've been kind of distraught if I should talk about the Penn State thing. It's sad, it's horrible, it's detestable. It's all the bad things that you can come up with as far as adjectives. But overall, it's just sad. Many of us may look at the situation at Penn State and be able to shake our fingers at what's going on, and rightfully so, and many of the things that I know I've heard. I know many of us probably share the same sentiment of saying, if I was there, I would have tried to do something, anything, to help those young boys. So in an interesting way, talking about not just thinking about what we do, but what we actually should be doing, it got me to thinking about a wonderful devotion given by Dave Castor, who is not only a fantasy footballer with us here at St. Paul for the last 2 years, but he's also a church council member. And he was in charge of giving devotions at our last church council meeting, and he did a wonderful job. So I asked him if I could use some of his thoughts on this video today, and he agreed. Do any of you remember those WWJD bracelets? You remember those? They were really popular a few years ago, especially with young people, and they were there to help those young people and help anyone in particular think about what those letters stood for in their decision-making process, especially when something was difficult or they had a tough time figuring out which way was the right way, which path to choose. Of course, if you remember the bracelets, you remember what WWJD stood for. What would Jesus do? I agree that asking what would Jesus do is a very important question. But it's interesting, what would Jesus do doesn't actually call me to action. It calls me to think about it, which is a very, very important first step. But maybe another thing that we can look at, instead of WWJD, is WWID. What will I do? That takes us away from the passive and puts us into the active. What will I do? Certainly thinking WWJD should influence WWID. A little bit ago, I preached a sermon on how sometimes our actions don't always line up with our words. I know my mom was famous for saying those things. Your actions speak louder than your words. She was right. It's easy for us to know what Jesus would do. After all, we have the Bible. And in the Bible, we see exactly what Jesus would do. And not only that, we know exactly what Jesus did do, because it tells us right there. It's easy to agree with the theory of Jesus. It's easy to agree with the theory of the Bible. But it's not always easy to put all those concepts into action. And that's what our faith calls us to do. Not only do we want to focus on what Jesus would do, but we also want to focus on what will I do? What will we do? Paired up with Jesus, what will we do as a church? What will I do as a response for what God has done for me? What will I do to show my love for God through actions, through helping my neighbor? What will I do in the church to carry out its mission that God has put before us? What would Jesus do? To find that answer, all we need to do is look to the cross. Perhaps what each of us should be asking is not only the question of what would Jesus do, but maybe also ask, what will I do? What will Jesus do within me today in my heart that will go from the inside out to step up not only for the church, but for Jesus himself, to show God's love to others this day through our thoughts, our words, and our deeds. There was an opportunity with Penn State to do the right thing, to stop a horrible thing from happening, and they didn't take full advantage of that opportunity. Today, God's providing us opportunities. What will you do with that opportunity today? So, for Fantasy Football Devotions, I'm your host, Pastor Aaron Layne of St. Paul Lutheran Church, and I'll remind you again this week to take care and to give care in the name of the one from whom all blessings flow. Have a wonderful weekend.